Millions of these heavy shipping containers cross the ocean every single year, carrying the physical weight of our global trade. Today, a growing portion of that cargo is subject to a complex, overlapping layer of U.S. customs duties. After decades of a broad free trade consensus, tariffs return to the center of American economic policy. The current system bundles several distinct objectives together. Policymakers are deploying tariffs to generate federal revenue, shield domestic manufacturing, and punish geopolitical rivals, all at the same time. The public and politicians alike often treat these separate economic objectives as interchangeable. They are not. A look at the fiscal records and economic research proves that a single tariff cannot logically achieve all of these macroeconomic goals simultaneously. This is a macroeconomic trilemma. When you attempt to maximize three inherently conflicting metrics at once, the system breaks down. The political assumption is that simply pushing up the overall tariff rate will naturally elevate revenue, protection, and the trade balance altogether. Fiscal records and Federal Reserve modeling from 2018 through 2026 expose this assumption as mathematically false. A tariff is a surgical instrument. It carries highly specific trade-offs, and it cannot function as a catch-all strategy for generating national wealth. If you maximize one of these metrics, like shielding a domestic industry from foreign competition, you mechanically force a failure in government revenue generation. In fiscal year 2025, customs duties more than doubled, reaching nearly $195 billion. That is a substantial number, larger than the annual budgets of many federal departments. But we have to contextualize it against the total scale of government spending. This chart shows the FY 2025 federal budget receipts. Individual income taxes make up 51% of the pie. Customs duties, despite the recent spike, account for less than 4% of every dollar collected. Even under the most aggressive projections for the coming decade, tariffs cannot functionally replace the country's principal domestic income and payroll taxes. There is an underlying mechanical contradiction between using tariffs to raise revenue and using them to protect domestic factories. Federal Reserve modeling illustrates the problem. A tariff only generates cash if foreign goods successfully cross the border. If the tariff works as intended, tariff eliminates the possibility of generating revenue. Furthermore, initial customs collections are deceptive. They often act as contingent liabilities rather than durable income. Executive branch tariffs are frequently enacted under emergency powers legislation, making them vulnerable to challenges in federal court. When the Supreme Court recently invalidated a round of these emergency tariffs, the effective tax rate on imported goods instantly fell by 8 percentage points. The Treasury had already recorded those initial collections as receipts. As a result, the government was forced to pay out $70 billion in refunds to importers during May and June of 2026. This legal uncertainty turns gross customs collections into a fiscal mirage. They are incapable of securing long-term federal deficits because the money can be recalled by judicial order at any time. To understand who is actually funding these collections, we have to look at tax incidence. This is the analysis of who ultimately bears the burden of a tax, regardless of whose name is on the check. A tariff is legally collected from the U.S. importer bringing a product through customs. It is never a payment directly transferred from a foreign government to the U.S. Treasury. This supply chain diagram tracks the financial burden. When enacted, the cost hits the border. Bypassing the foreign producer, the financial weight lands squarely on U.S. importers and retailers, who absorb the initial shock by temporarily compressing their own profit margins. Detailed research from Amiti, Redding, and Weinstein shows that foreign exporters generally do not lower their wholesale prices to absorb the tariff. Additional Federal Reserve data confirms that price pressure accumulates gradually rather than appearing immediately. Eventually, margin compression breaks. Within 7 months, pass-through becomes a complete dollar-for-dollar transmission, dropping the entire cost directly onto the end buyer. Lower-income households spend a larger proportion of their income on basic consumable goods and have less capacity to postpone purchases. In practice, this means the tariff functions exactly like a regressive national sales tax, disguised as a foreign penalty. The strongest economic argument for tariffs is that they succeed in artificially boosting output in directly protected domestic sectors. U.S. International Trade Commission data shows tariffs increased domestic steel and aluminum production. However, those protected raw materials are mandatory inputs for other domestic businesses. Making those inputs more expensive cost downstream manufacturing an estimated $3.5 billion in output. The aggregate financial losses of those downstream manufacturers entirely eclipse the localized gains of the protected steel and aluminum plants combined. If tariffs distort domestic production this heavily, why do they fail to balance overall global inputs and exports? This is driven by trade diversion. Companies avoid the penalty by moving supply chains to third-party countries like Vietnam or Mexico. Trade diversion does not equal reshoring. The U.S. continues to import the same volume of goods, just from a different, slightly more expensive geographic origin. Protecting a single upstream industry mechanically generates an aggregate loss across the broader manufacturing base, all while failing to close the overall trade deficit. In July 2026, a new justification emerged for levying massive countrywide tariffs, pressuring other economies to enact prohibitions on goods made using forced labor. Combating coerced labor is a legitimate and necessary geopolitical trade objective. Goods produced through human rights violations undercut producers operating under lawful standards. But applying a blanket countrywide tax creates a targeting problem. It penalizes firms that can demonstrate clean supply chains just as heavily as those using coerced labor. To be effective, these measures require transparent benchmarks, giving foreign governments and suppliers a clear path to tariff removal upon verified compliance. Without precise, measurable off-ramps, a human rights measure quickly degrades into an inescapable inflationary tax on the U.S. consumer. The empirical record is clear. Tariffs are not costless payments made by foreign nations, and they are incapable of erasing macroeconomic trade deficits. To be economically defensible, policymakers must stop using tariffs as broad strategies. They must be deployed as highly targeted, conditional instruments. By separating the goals and applying specific duties with scheduled reviews, the system avoids the friction that destroys broader economic value. Furthermore, these trade barriers alone are insufficient. They must be paired with massive domestic investments and worker training to succeed. Ultimately, a tariff can easily make foreign goods more expensive for Americans to buy. It cannot, by itself, build competitive domestic capacity, and it cannot generate national wealth.